Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back, way back, to when the very first humans set foot on what would become the Americas. Picture this. It's around 15,000 years ago, maybe even earlier, and you're standing on a massive bridge of frozen land connecting Asia to Alaska. The world is locked in an ice age so severe that ocean levels have dropped hundreds of feet, exposing this temporary highway between continents. You're wrapped in carefully sewn animal skins, carrying tools your ancestors perfected over thousands of years, and you're about to become one of the most successful explorers in human history. Though you probably won't survive the journey if you make even one serious mistake about where to find food or shelter. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing our global bedtime community come together. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're part of small bands of hunter-gatherers, maybe 20 or 30 people total, following mammoth herds across this vast grassland called Beringia. The wind cuts through your clothing with an intensity that would make a modern Canadian winter feel tropical. Your people have been making this migration gradually, generation by generation, not realizing they're writing the opening chapter of an entirely new world's human story. Some of you came earlier, possibly as far back as 40,000 years ago, though historians still argue whether these earliest dates are accurate or if the main migration happened closer to 15,000 years ago. As you move south through ice-free corridors, you're entering landscapes no human has ever seen. Massive ground sloths lumber through forests of trees so enormous they dwarf today's redwoods. Saber-toothed cats stalk prey, while American lions, larger than any modern African lion, roam territories the size of entire states. You're essentially walking into a real-life version of a fantasy novel, except instead of dragons, you've got 12-foot-tall bears that could probably bench press a pickup truck.
Your toolkit is surprisingly sophisticated. You craft spear points so precisely balanced that archaeologists thousands of years later will marvel at their engineering. The Clovis point, that distinctive fluted stone blade your descendants will perfect, becomes as iconic to American prehistory as the pyramids are to Egypt. You're not just randomly wandering, you're following animal trails, seasonal patterns, and water sources with a precision that puts modern GPS to shame. Within just a few thousand years, your people have spread from Alaska to Chile, a migration covering over 10,000 miles through every conceivable climate and terrain. You adapt with stunning speed, developing new hunting techniques for each environment. In the Arctic, you perfect ice fishing and learn to hunt seals. In the Great Plains, you become masters of communal buffalo hunting. Along the coasts, you build sophisticated boats and develop maritime cultures that will thrive for millennia. Here's something quirky that most people don't realize. By the time Europeans arrive in the Americas, your descendants will have domesticated more plant species than any other region on Earth. While Old World peoples were growing wheat, barley, and rice, Native Americans independently developed corn, beans, squash, potatoes, tomatoes, chocolate, tobacco, and dozens of other crops that now feed the world. You're essentially conducting the largest agricultural experiment in human history without even knowing it. The megafauna around you won't last long, though. Within a few thousand years of human arrival, most of North America's giant mammals go extinct. Whether this was due to hunting pressure, climate change, or both remains one of archaeology's hottest debates. What's certain is that you're witnessing the end of an era, the last time enormous mammals will dominate the American landscape until European colonists reintroduce horses centuries later.
Your spiritual worldview is developing alongside these material adaptations.
You begin to see the landscape itself as sacred, developing creation stories that explain how your people emerged from specific places, the Grand Canyon, certain mountains, particular lakes or rivers. Unlike Old World religions that often emphasize humanity's dominance over nature, your emerging belief systems typically stress harmony and reciprocity with the natural world. This isn't just feel-good environmentalism, it's practical survival wisdom developed over thousands of years of living intimately with diverse ecosystems. By 10,000 BC, you've established the foundation for what will become hundreds of distinct cultures, languages, and ways of life. Your descendants will include Arctic whalers, desert agriculturalists, woodland hunters, coastal fishermen, and Great Plains nomads. Each group will develop technologies perfectly suited to their environment, from igloos to adobe pueblos to longhouses that could shelter entire extended families. The most remarkable thing about this initial migration is its success rate. Unlike later human expansions into new territories, which often involved violence and displacement, you're moving into essentially empty continents. There are no competing human populations to fight, no established political systems to overthrow. You're writing human history on a blank slate, creating entirely new ways of organizing society from scratch. As you settle into these new lands, you're already beginning to modify the environment around you. You use controlled burning to manage forests, creating park-like landscapes that will support both wildlife and human communities for thousands of years. You're not just adapting to nature, you're entering into a partnership with it, creating what ecologists now call anthropogenic landscapes. Environments shaped by thoughtful human management rather than exploitation.
Fast forward several thousand years, and you're no longer following mammoth herds across frozen tundra. Instead, you're kneeling in rich soil, carefully planting kernels of something that barely resembles the corn we know today. These early corn cobs are tiny, about the size of your thumb, but they represent one of humanity's greatest agricultural breakthroughs. You're participating in a revolution that will transform scattered hunter-gatherer bands into some of the most sophisticated civilizations the world has ever seen. Your ancestors discovered that a wild grass called teosinte could be selectively bred into something much more useful. Through countless generations of choosing the best seeds, replanting, and gradual improvement, you've created maize. It's agricultural engineering that rivals anything modern geneticists accomplish, except you're doing it entirely through patience, observation, and trial and error. Historians still argue whether this breakthrough happened in one location and spread, or if multiple groups independently figured out plant domestication across different regions. Around 3500 BC, you're living in what archaeologists will later call the Archaic period, but you're experiencing something far more dynamic than that dusty term suggests. Your communities are growing larger and more permanent, as agriculture provides food security that hunting and gathering simply can't match. You're developing pottery to store surplus grain, creating trade networks that stretch across continents, and building the first permanent settlements that will eventually grow into massive cities. The three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, become your agricultural foundation. This isn't just about nutrition, it's sophisticated ecological science. The corn provides a natural trellis for beans to climb, while beans fix nitrogen in the soil that feeds the corn and squash. The broad squash leaves shade the ground, retaining moisture and preventing weeds. You've essentially created a sustainable farming system that feeds more people per acre than many modern agricultural methods. Take that, industrial farming.
By 1000 BC, you're witnessing the rise of complex societies that would make European nobles jealous. The Olmec civilization in what's now Mexico is carving massive stone heads weighing up to 40 tons, and moving them hundreds of miles without wheeled vehicles or large domesticated animals. Their ball courts, elaborate art, and sophisticated calendar systems establish patterns that will influence cultures across the Americas for thousands of years. But here's something wonderfully weird. While Old World civilizations are obsessing over bronze and iron, you're creating incredible art and tools from materials like obsidian, jade, and specially treated wood. Obsidian blades can be sharper than modern surgical scalpels, and your jade-working techniques produce jewelry so intricate that contemporary artisans struggle to replicate the methods. Move north and you're building Poverty Point in Louisiana around 1700 BC, a massive earthwork complex with concentric ridges that could hold thousands of people. The precision engineering required to move millions of cubic yards of earth using only baskets and human labor makes the Egyptian pyramids look like weekend DIY projects. These aren't primitive earth mounds, they're sophisticated urban planning that demonstrates advanced understanding of astronomy, hydrology, and social organization. As centuries pass, you're creating increasingly spectacular civilizations. The Maya developed writing systems more sophisticated than anything in Europe at the time. Mathematical concepts including zero, which Europeans won't figure out for centuries, and astronomical observations so precise they can predict eclipses hundreds of years in advance. Their cities feature multi-story buildings, elaborate water management systems, and art programs that would make Renaissance princes weep with envy.
In the American Southwest, you're becoming master architects, building apartment complexes into cliff faces that remain structurally sound 1,000 years later. Mesa Verde and similar sites aren't just homes, they're marvels of engineering that incorporate passive solar heating, sophisticated ventilation systems, and community planning that prioritize both defense and social cohesion. You're basically creating ancient versions of sustainable architecture that modern green building movements are still trying to perfect. The Mississippian culture transforms the American heartland into a network of thriving cities connected by rivers that serve as highways for trade goods traveling from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, becomes larger than London during the same period. You're living in a cosmopolitan urban environment with specialized craftspeople, complex social hierarchies, and ceremonial complexes that rival anything being built in medieval Europe. Your trade networks are mind-bogglingly extensive. Copper from the Great Lakes finds its way to Florida, while shells from the Gulf Coast end up in burial sites near the Canadian border. You're moving luxury goods, raw materials, and finished products across distances that won't be matched again until railroads arrive centuries later. This isn't random wandering, it's sophisticated commercial organization that requires standardized weights, measures, and probably some form of credit systems. Meanwhile, in South America, you're creating civilizations that put European engineering to shame. The Inca will eventually build road systems through mountain terrain so challenging that modern engineers struggle to maintain highways along similar routes. Their agricultural terraces turn steep mountainsides into productive farmland while preventing erosion, sustainable farming techniques that still work perfectly today.
What's remarkable is the diversity of solutions you develop for similar problems. Desert peoples create elaborate irrigation systems that support large populations in seemingly impossible environments. Arctic cultures develop technologies for surviving in conditions that would kill most humans within hours. Forest dwellers build longhouses that can shelter dozens of families while using natural materials so efficiently that the structures leave virtually no environmental impact. Your astronomical observations rival those of any civilization worldwide. You're tracking planetary movements, predicting seasonal changes with incredible precision, and incorporating cosmic cycles into everything from agricultural planning to ceremonial calendars. By 1000 AD, you've created a hemisphere filled with sophisticated civilizations, each perfectly adapted to their environment and connected through trade, cultural exchange, and shared innovations. You've domesticated plants that now feed billions of people worldwide, developed architectural techniques still used today, and created art that influences styles across the globe.
The year is 1491, and you're living in what might be the most densely populated hemisphere on Earth. Your cities rival Paris and London in size and sophistication. Your trade networks span continents. Your agricultural systems feed millions of people sustainably. You have no idea that everything is about to change forever, because 3 small ships are sailing across an ocean that you didn't even know existed, carrying men who think they've found a route to Asia. When Christopher Columbus stumbles onto Caribbean islands, you're one of the Taino people who approach these strange visitors with curiosity rather than hostility. These pale, hairy men smell terrible, like they haven't bathed in months, which they haven't, and they wear more metal than seems practical. They speak in incomprehensible sounds and seem obsessed with a soft yellow metal that you use primarily for decoration. You offer them food, water, and hospitality, following cultural traditions that have governed interactions with strangers for centuries. What you don't realize is that you're experiencing the most catastrophic biological event in human history. The Europeans carried diseases that have never existed in the Americas: smallpox, measles, typhus, bubonic plague, and dozens of others. Your immune systems, developed over thousands of years of isolation from Old World pathogens, have no defense against these invisible invaders. Within a few decades, disease will kill an estimated 90% of Native American populations, making the Black Death in Europe look like a mild flu outbreak. The demographic collapse happened so quickly it defies comprehension. Cities that house tens of thousands of people are abandoned within a generation. Entire languages disappear when their last speakers die. Agricultural systems that sustained millions of people are reclaimed by forests so rapidly that the regrowth actually affects global climate by absorbing massive amounts of carbon dioxide. But you're fighting back in ways that often get overlooked in simplified historical narratives. Pueblo peoples in the Southwest organize successful revolts that drive Spanish colonists out for decades at a time. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680 remains one of the most successful indigenous uprisings in American history, temporarily reversing Spanish colonization across a vast region. You're not passive victims. You're strategic resistors adapting to impossible circumstances.
Hernán Cortés arrives in Mexico and encounters the Aztec Empire at its absolute peak. Tenochtitlan is larger and more sophisticated than any European city, with floating gardens, running water systems, and architectural marvels that leave Spanish conquistadors speechless. Yet within 2 years, this magnificent civilization has collapsed, not primarily because of Spanish military superiority, but because smallpox kills the emperor and devastates the population, while Spanish horses and steel weapons provide just enough advantage to tip already unstable political balances. Here's something fascinatingly weird that most people don't know. The conquistadors succeed largely because they arrive during a period of unprecedented political upheaval among Native American empires. The Aztecs have recently expanded their territory through military conquest, creating a network of resentful tributary states that see the Spanish as potential allies against their imperial overlords. You're witnessing one of history's most dramatic examples of how timing can determine the fate of civilizations. Meanwhile, in North America, you're experiencing a different but equally devastating pattern of colonization. European diseases spread along your ancient trade routes faster than the Europeans themselves, depopulating entire regions before direct contact even occurs. French fur traders arriving in the Great Lakes region encounter landscapes that seem suspiciously empty, not realizing they're moving through territories that recently supported thriving communities. The Spanish mission system in California and the Southwest attempts to convert you to Christianity while essentially enslaving you for agricultural labor. The missions sound peaceful, but they're essentially concentration camps where your children are separated from families, your languages are forbidden, and your traditional spiritual practices are violently suppressed. Native peoples who try to leave are hunted down and returned by force. Historians still argue whether the system constitutes genocide, but the mortality rates in missions speak for themselves.
You're also discovering that European concepts of land ownership make no sense within your worldview. To you, land is a living entity that supports communities through reciprocal relationships. You manage territories, harvest resources sustainably, and maintain sacred sites. But the idea of owning land the way Europeans own objects seems bizarre and spiritually dangerous. When Europeans produce papers claiming they've purchased vast territories, you often don't realize you supposedly sold your homeland forever. The Columbian Exchange transforms both hemispheres in ways that extend far beyond human conflict. European horses revolutionize Plains Indian cultures, creating the mounted warrior societies that will dominate the Great Plains for centuries. But you're also receiving less beneficial imports. European weeds crowd out native plants, European livestock overgraze delicate ecosystems, and European diseases jump from humans to animals, affecting wildlife populations. Your crops are simultaneously transforming European diets and economies. Potatoes become so central to Irish survival that crop failures cause mass starvation. Corn feeds European populations through difficult winters and provides cheap nutrition for African slaves. Chocolate becomes a luxury obsession among European elites. Tobacco creates entire colonial economies based on plantation agriculture. You've essentially provided the crops that fuel European expansion while receiving epidemic diseases in return. Some of you are adapting to European presence through strategic alliance building and cultural modification. The Cherokee developed written constitutions, European-style agriculture, and even slave-holding practices in attempts to prove their civilization to white Americans. The Iroquois Confederacy becomes a major power broker between competing European empires, playing French, Dutch, and English interests against each other while maintaining political independence. But adaptation strategies that work in one region fail catastrophically in others. The Inca attempt to incorporate Spanish conquistadors into their existing political system, offering them positions as provincial governors. They don't understand that Europeans operate under entirely different cultural assumptions about power, reciprocity, and social organization. Francisco Pizarro exploits this misunderstanding to capture the Inca emperor and effectively destroy an empire through political manipulation rather than military conquest.
By 1600, you're living through the most dramatic population collapse in human history while simultaneously fighting to maintain cultural identity, political autonomy, and spiritual traditions under conditions that no human societies have ever previously faced. Some communities are collaborating with Europeans, others are retreating deeper into continental interiors, and many are developing entirely new forms of resistance that blend traditional practices with strategic adaptation to colonial realities. The collision of these two worlds creates hybrid cultures, new forms of racism, and political systems that will define the Americas for centuries. You're not witnessing a simple conquest. You're experiencing one of history's most complex cultural transformations, where survival requires constant improvisation and traditional knowledge systems must evolve at unprecedented speed. It's 1830, and you're standing in your ancestral homeland in Georgia, holding a piece of paper that's supposed to be worth something, a treaty promising you'll be safe, that your boundaries are permanent, that white settlers will respect your sovereignty. You've learned to read English specifically so you could understand these documents, but the paper feels worthless in your hands because President Andrew Jackson has just signed the Indian Removal Act.
You're Cherokee, and despite winning your case in the Supreme Court, despite adopting European-style government and agriculture, despite doing everything white Americans said would prove your civilization, you're about to be forced from your home at gunpoint. The Trail of Tears isn't just one tragic march. It's a series of brutal relocations affecting dozens of native nations across the Southeast. You watch as elderly people who've never traveled beyond their tribal boundaries are loaded onto wagons for a 1,000-mile journey to unfamiliar territory. Children are separated from parents, sacred objects are abandoned because you can only carry what fits in your hands. The death toll reaches into the thousands, and survivors arrive in Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma, traumatized, impoverished, and facing the challenge of rebuilding entire societies from scratch. But here's something that often gets overlooked in the tragedy. You're not just passively enduring removal. Cherokee leaders like John Ross fight the policy through every legal channel available, hiring white lawyers, lobbying Congress, and creating a sophisticated media campaign to build public opposition. Some of you are organizing underground networks to help people escape removal, while others are negotiating for better conditions during the forced marches. You're demonstrating that resistance takes many forms beyond armed conflict.
Meanwhile, out west, you're experiencing a completely different type of pressure as American expansion accelerates after the Mexican-American War. The discovery of gold in California brings hundreds of thousands of miners streaming through territories you've controlled for centuries. Unlike earlier European colonization that at least pretended to respect native sovereignty through treaties, these gold rushers operate under the assumption that Indians are simply obstacles to be removed or eliminated. The California gold rush becomes a genocide so systematic that the state government actually pays bounties for Indian scalps. You're hunted like animals, with militia groups organizing weekend raids against native communities. The California Indian population drops from around 150,000 to fewer than 30,000 in just 2 decades. It's ethnic cleansing conducted with industrial efficiency and state government funding. On the Great Plains, you're adapting to a transformed landscape where horses, those animals your ancestors never saw, have revolutionized your entire way of life. Plains tribes like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Comanche have become some of the most formidable light cavalry in world history. Your military tactics are so effective that U.S. Army officers study them for insights into mobile warfare. You're essentially fighting a guerrilla campaign across territories the size of European countries, using mobility and knowledge of terrain to offset American advantages in numbers and firepower. The buffalo herds that sustain plains cultures are under systematic attack as American policymakers realize that destroying your food source is more effective than direct military confrontation. Professional hunters kill millions of buffalo, primarily for their hides, leaving carcasses to rot on the prairie. It's biological warfare disguised as economic development. By the 1880s, herds that once numbered in the tens of millions are reduced to a few hundred animals, and your entire way of life collapses along with them. Historians still argue whether this buffalo slaughter was deliberately planned genocide or simply the unintended consequence of industrial capitalism, but the results are identical either way. You're watching your cultural foundation disappear in less than a generation, forcing adaptations that no human societies should have to make.
Your resistance efforts produce legendary figures whose names become synonymous with Indigenous defiance. Sitting Bull combines military leadership with spiritual authority, creating alliances between traditionally rival tribes while maintaining that cooperation with Americans inevitably leads to cultural destruction. His victory at Little Bighorn in 1876 represents the last major military defeat of the U.S. Army by native forces, but it also triggers a massive retaliation that ultimately destroys Lakota independence. Geronimo leads Apache raids across the Southwest with such effectiveness that his capture requires 1/4 of the entire U.S. Army. His tactics of using desert terrain and intimate knowledge of water sources to outmaneuver much larger forces become textbook examples of asymmetric warfare. But even Geronimo eventually surrenders, not because he's militarily defeated, but because continued fighting means watching his people slowly starve in mountain hideouts. Here's something wonderfully defiant that most people don't realize. Throughout this period of military defeat, you're simultaneously creating new forms of cultural resistance that will prove more durable than armed rebellion. Ghost dance movements sweep across the plains, combining traditional spiritual practices with Christian symbolism to create religions that promise the return of buffalo herds and the disappearance of white settlers. These aren't just spiritual movements. They're sophisticated psychological responses to trauma that help communities maintain identity under impossible conditions. The reservation system that emerges from these conflicts isn't designed to help you. It's designed to make you disappear through forced assimilation. You're confined to the worst land that white settlers don't want, given inadequate food supplies and subjected to Indian agents who often embezzle funds meant for your survival. The system creates conditions so harsh that many people simply die from malnutrition and preventable diseases. But you're finding ways to subvert even these oppressive conditions. Some of you become skilled at playing different government bureaucrats against each other, exploiting contradictions in federal Indian policy to secure better treatment. Others use traditional diplomatic skills to build alliances with sympathetic white reformers who oppose the worst abuses of the reservation system. The Dawes Act of 1887 represents a new strategy for destroying tribal identity through individual land ownership. Instead of maintaining reservations as collective tribal territory, the government divides communal lands into individual plots, with surplus land sold to white settlers. It's cultural engineering designed to transform you from tribal members into individual property owners who will supposedly assimilate into mainstream American society.
This policy fails spectacularly at assimilation, but succeeds brilliantly at land theft. Tribal landholdings drop from 138 million acres to 48 million acres within a generation. Much of what remains is desert or otherwise unsuitable for agriculture. You're simultaneously losing your economic base and the territorial foundation for tribal identity, which was exactly the point of the policy. Yet even under these conditions, you're maintaining cultural practices through underground networks, oral traditions, and adaptive strategies that blend traditional knowledge with survival skills learned through bitter experience. Remember those Three Sisters crops from centuries earlier? You're still growing corn, beans, and squash in hidden gardens, preserving not just plants, but the agricultural knowledge systems that sustained your ancestors for thousands of years. It's 1879, and you're 6 years old, when men in uniforms arrive at your reservation home to take you to a place called Carlisle Industrial School. Your parents try to hide you, but there's no escape. Federal law now requires all Native children to attend boarding schools designed, in the words of the school's founder, to kill the Indian and save the man. You're about to enter an institution specifically created to destroy everything that makes you who you are. The train ride to Pennsylvania is the furthest you've ever traveled from home, and when you arrive at Carlisle, the first thing they do is cut your hair. This isn't just a haircut. In your culture, hair represents spiritual connection and personal identity. Watching your braids fall to the floor feels like watching pieces of your soul being severed. Then they burn your clothes, scrub you with harsh soap until your skin is raw, and force you into a military-style uniform that smells like chemicals and starch. Your name is taken away next. Whatever your parents called you, something that connects you to your clan, your spiritual identity, your place in the community, is replaced with an English name chosen from a list on the wall. You're now Robert, or Mary, or James, and if you're caught speaking your tribal language, you're beaten. Some children have their mouths washed out with soap. Others are locked in closets for days. The message is clear. Everything about your identity is wrong and must be erased. But here's what makes you tougher than these administrators expect. You're finding ways to maintain your culture even under these oppressive conditions. You whisper stories to younger children in dormitories after lights out. You teach traditional games disguised as play during rare free moments. You remember songs, ceremonies, and family stories with the intensity of someone preserving the last remnants of a burning library. The curriculum at these schools is designed to train you for the lowest levels of American society. Boys learn agricultural labor and simple trades like blacksmithing or carpentry. Girls are taught domestic work, cooking, cleaning, and sewing. The education deliberately limits your opportunities while destroying your connection to tribal communities. You're being shaped into a servant class that will never threaten white economic or political dominance.
Disease runs rampant through these institutions because administrators prioritize discipline over health. Tuberculosis, trachoma, and other infectious diseases spread through overcrowded dormitories. The death rate at some boarding schools reaches 25%, higher than many military units during wartime. When children die, they're often buried in unmarked graves on school grounds rather than being returned to their families. Historians still argue whether this mortality rate represents intentional neglect or merely the callous indifference of underfunded institutions, but the trauma for survivors remains identical. Meanwhile, back on reservations, your parents and grandparents are fighting their own battles for cultural survival. Federal policies now prohibit traditional religious practices, making it illegal to perform sun dances, potlatch ceremonies, or other rituals that have sustained your communities for thousands of years. Indian agents can have you imprisoned for participating in savage religious activities, so ceremonies move underground, conducted in remote locations with lookouts posted to watch for government officials. Your traditional healers are being replaced by government-appointed doctors who often have no understanding of native medical practices or cultural approaches to wellness. Plants that your people have used for centuries are dismissed as superstition, while Western medicine focuses on treating symptoms rather than the holistic health approaches that integrated physical, spiritual, and community well-being. The allotment system that broke up tribal lands is creating a new form of poverty, unlike anything your ancestors experienced. Individual land ownership sounds reasonable in theory, but most tribal members receive plots too small or too poor to support families through farming. Many people are forced to lease their land to white farmers for tiny payments, creating a system where you're technically a landowner but practically a tenant on your own property. Some of you are adapting to these impossible circumstances through strategic cultural blending. You're learning to speak English fluently while secretly maintaining your tribal languages. You're adopting Christianity but incorporating traditional spiritual practices into Christian worship. You're wearing European-style clothing, but embroidering traditional designs into the fabric. It's cultural camouflage that allows survival while maintaining identity.
The peyote religion emerges during this period as a brilliant example of adaptive resistance. By incorporating Christian symbolism and language into traditional spiritual practices, Native communities create a religious movement that's technically legal, but fundamentally indigenous. It spreads across dozens of tribes, creating networks of cultural exchange and mutual support that help communities survive the boarding school era. World War I provides an unexpected opportunity for some of you to demonstrate patriotism while challenging racist stereotypes. Despite being denied citizenship, thousands of Native Americans volunteer for military service. Your traditional warrior cultures adapt surprisingly well to modern combat, and many of you serve with distinction in European trenches.
The war experience gives you new arguments for civil rights and citizenship while providing skills and confidence that will prove crucial for later activism. But the 1920s bring new threats disguised as progress. The federal government begins promoting policies of termination, officially ending the special legal relationship between tribes and the United States. It sounds like freedom, but it's actually a strategy for eliminating tribal sovereignty and forcing complete assimilation into mainstream American society. You're being offered equality that requires abandoning everything that makes you Native American. The Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 grants citizenship to all Native Americans, but it's a double-edged sword. While citizenship provides certain legal protections, it also undermines arguments for tribal sovereignty and treaty rights. Some tribal leaders oppose citizenship, arguing that accepting it implies abandoning their status as members of sovereign nations. The legal complexities created by dual citizenship, tribal and American, will complicate Native rights issues for decades.
Throughout this period, you're maintaining oral traditions with the dedication of professional librarians. Elders who survived the buffalo hunts are telling stories to children who've returned from boarding schools, creating bridges between pre-contact knowledge and survival skills needed for the modern world. These aren't just entertaining tales. They're sophisticated educational systems that preserve everything from ecological knowledge to social organization principles. Here's something remarkably hopeful that most people don't realize. Despite decades of systematic cultural destruction, tribal languages, ceremonies, and traditional knowledge are surviving in ways that will eventually enable cultural renaissance. You're creating hidden networks of cultural preservation that operate like underground railroads for indigenous identity, moving sacred knowledge through families and communities despite government prohibition. The Great Depression hits Native communities especially hard because you're already living in poverty conditions that make the mainstream economic collapse seem almost routine. But economic desperation also creates opportunities for New Deal programs specifically designed to help tribal communities. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 reverses some of the most destructive assimilation policies, allowing tribes to adopt constitutional governments and regain control over some of their affairs. By the 1940s, you've survived the darkest century in Native American history, but you've done more than simply endure. You've adapted, preserved, and maintained cultural identity under conditions designed to make that impossible. The foundations for cultural revival and political sovereignty are being laid by people who refuse to let their identities be erased, no matter what the cost.
It's November 1969, and you're standing on the deck of a boat approaching Alcatraz Island, heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. You're part of a group of Native American activists who are about to do something unprecedented. Occupy this abandoned federal prison and declare it Indian land by treaty rights. The 19-month occupation that follows will spark the most significant Native American political movement since the Indian Wars, transforming you from survivors of cultural genocide into architects of cultural renaissance. The American Indian movement emerges from urban communities where federal relocation policies have concentrated thousands of Native people in cities like Minneapolis, Chicago, and Los Angeles. These policies were designed to scatter tribal members and accelerate assimilation, but they accidentally create something officials never anticipated: intertribal political networks where Lakota, Cherokee, Navajo, and dozens of other nations share experiences and develop collective strategies for resistance. Your occupations aren't just symbolic gestures, they're sophisticated media campaigns designed to educate the American public about treaty violations and ongoing injustices. When you take over Alcatraz, you issue a proclamation offering to purchase the island for $24 in glass beads and red cloth, the same amount the Dutch supposedly paid for Manhattan. It's brilliant political theater that uses humor to make serious points about land theft and broken promises. The trail of broken treaties in 1972 brings caravans of native activists to Washington, D.C., where you present a 20-point position paper demanding restoration of tribal sovereignty, federal recognition of treaty rights, and fundamental changes in federal Indian policy. When the government ignores your demands, you occupy the Bureau of Indian Affairs building, turning the agency that's controlled your lives for over a century into a symbol of native political power.
But it's Wounded Knee in 1973 that captures global attention and transforms AIM into international symbols of indigenous resistance. For 71 days, you hold this historic site where the 7th Cavalry massacred hundreds of Lakota people in 1890, creating a powerful connection between historical trauma and contemporary political action. Federal marshals and FBI agents surround your encampment, but you've chosen a location so symbolically important that violent suppression would create martyrs and international condemnation. The siege becomes a media sensation that forces Americans to confront the ongoing reality of colonialism within their own borders. You're broadcasting from Wounded Knee using sophisticated communication equipment, giving interviews to international journalists, and building solidarity with liberation movements across the globe. Indigenous activists from other countries visit your encampment, creating networks that will support native rights movements for decades. Meanwhile, you're simultaneously fighting legal battles that are reshaping federal Indian law. The American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978 finally makes traditional spiritual practices legal again, ending nearly a century of religious persecution. The Indian Child Welfare Act addresses the ongoing trauma of family separation by giving tribal governments authority over adoption and foster care decisions involving Native children. Here's something wonderfully ironic that most people don't realize. The same federal policies designed to destroy tribal identity are accidentally creating the legal foundations for modern tribal sovereignty. The Indian Self-Determination Act allows tribes to contract with the federal government to run their own programs, essentially transforming you from wards of the state into government contractors with substantial autonomy over education, healthcare, and social services. The casino industry emerges from legal battles over tribal sovereignty rather than simple entrepreneurship. When tribes assert their right to regulate gaming on reservation lands, they're not just opening businesses, they're exercising governmental powers that federal and state authorities have been trying to limit for over 2 centuries. The revenues from gaming provide unprecedented economic independence that funds everything from tribal colleges to language preservation programs.
Your cultural renaissance extends far beyond politics and economics into arts, literature, and intellectual life. Native American writers like N. Scott Momaday, Leslie Marmon Silko, and Louise Erdrich are creating literature that transforms how Americans understand indigenous experiences. Their novels and poetry don't just tell Native stories, they challenge fundamental assumptions about American identity, history, and values. Tribal colleges emerge as institutions that blend traditional knowledge with contemporary education, creating graduates who are as comfortable discussing quantum physics as they are performing traditional ceremonies. These schools become centers for language revitalization, with immersion programs that are teaching children to speak Cherokee, Navajo, and dozens of other tribal languages with fluency that seemed impossible during the boarding school era. The repatriation movement forces American museums and universities to return sacred objects, human remains, and ceremonial items that were collected during the era of cultural suppression.
You're literally bringing your ancestors home while reclaiming control over how native cultures are represented and preserved. The National Museum of the American Indian, which opens on the National Mall in 2004, represents the first time Native peoples have controlled the narrative about their own histories in a major American institution. Environmental activism becomes a natural extension of traditional relationships with land and resources. You're fighting everything from uranium mining on Navajo lands to pipeline construction through sacred sites. But you're also developing innovative approaches to conservation that blend traditional ecological knowledge with contemporary environmental science. Tribal environmental programs often achieve better results than federal agencies because you understand ecosystems through thousands of years of sustainable management.
Historians still argue whether contemporary Native activism represents genuine cultural revival or simply strategic adaptation to modern political conditions. But the evidence speaks for itself. Tribal languages that seemed doomed to extinction are being spoken by new generations of children. Traditional arts that were nearly lost are experiencing explosive creativity and innovation. Ceremonies that were driven underground are being performed openly and with renewed spiritual significance. Today, you govern over 500 federally recognized tribal nations with combined economies worth hundreds of billions of dollars. You operate hospitals, universities, environmental programs, and social services, while maintaining cultural practices that connect you to ancestors who witnessed the first European arrivals. Some of your communities are among the most prosperous in their regions, while others still struggle with poverty, addiction, and the ongoing effects of historical trauma. The Internet age has created new opportunities for cultural preservation and political organization that your ancestors could never have imagined. You're using social media to teach traditional languages, coordinate political actions across vast distances, and build solidarity with indigenous movements worldwide. The same technologies that threaten to complete your cultural assimilation are becoming tools for cultural revitalization and political empowerment. Your young people are becoming doctors, lawyers, engineers, and artists, while also learning to perform traditional dances, speak ancestral languages, and carry on ceremonial responsibilities. They're creating hybrid identities that honor the past while engaging fully with contemporary realities. Exactly the kind of cultural persistence that boarding school officials thought was impossible to achieve. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that you're connected to an unbroken chain of survivors who maintained their humanity and cultural identity through conditions that would have destroyed weaker peoples. From those first footsteps across Beringia to contemporary fights for water rights and sacred site protection, your story is one of adaptation, resistance, and renewal that continues to shape the Americas in ways both subtle and profound.
The soft sounds of wind through trees, the distant call of night birds, the gentle rhythm of your breathing, these connect you to ancestors who heard the same sounds for thousands of years before European contact, and to descendants who will carry these relationships into futures you can barely imagine. Your survival isn't just personal, it's cultural, spiritual, and ultimately triumphant in ways that honor both ancient wisdom and contemporary innovation. Sleep peacefully, knowing that your people's greatest victories weren't won on battlefields, but in the quiet determination of parents teaching children their real names, elders preserving sacred stories, and communities choosing to remain who they are despite centuries of pressure to become something else. The mourning will bring new challenges, but it will also bring new opportunities to honor the incredible resilience that brought you to this moment in time.